Hello, everyone. Thanks for being here. I really appreciate the fact that you came here during basically lunch hour. Hope you will not regret this choice. I'm going to present a rather short overview of Hansa. But first, let me introduce myself. My name is Wlodek Gogloza. I'm representing Golem Foundation, specifically team working on Octant. But my presentation today is completely disconnected from what I'm doing right now in the foundation. In fact, it's more like a trip into memory lane, because before joining the foundation, I used to be an academic lawyer. I used to be a legal historian, and one of my area of interest was non-state societies or pre-state societies. I published quite a lot of how various non-centralized societies dealt with dispute resolutions problem and so on. Most of my research is actually on medieval Iceland, but today I'm going to present something that's, I believe, much more relevant to the issues discussed here, maybe not necessarily to the permanent hub, but definitely to the network state. So I'm going to be talking about this fascinating decentralized medieval merchant network that basically shaped the history and politics of Northern Europe for over 3 centuries. And can be seen as a medieval network state. Obviously, the parallels are not going to be one-to-one, even discounting the technological differences, but still I believe there are enough parallels for this particular example to be useful when thinking about how to design various aspects of network states, and maybe even if the idea that Balaji has is actually achievable in practice. There's fully matured nature state is actually achievable given the international order that we are finding ourselves in. Okay, so let me start. The first thing that you should really understand about the Hanseatic League is that it's not a result of any conscious design. There's no single founding act or decree. It actually emerged somewhat organically over several centuries during the High Middle Ages, mostly between 12th and 13th century. It started as a very loose group of German merchants that grouped together in order to provide protection for themselves. In 11th and also in 12th centuries, traveling in long distances in Europe was really dangerous. It was dangerous both because there was no infrastructure there, but also you have to deal with bandits, pirates, and also predatory rulers. So long-distance trade was risky, and long-distance trade with valuable merchandise was double risky. So in order to spread the risk to protect themselves, German merchants would create something they called Hansas, which were basically traveling guilds. They were created ad hoc. They were created in order to travel to certain destinations and to exploit certain markets. So the German merchants would group together and would travel to, for example, Gotland, and then try to establish a trade post there and start to profit from monopolizing certain commodity trades. And this was very unorganized, very ad hoc, very spontaneous for quite some time, at least for 100 years. Somewhere between the 12th and 13th centuries, this very loose group of merchants started to evolve into equally loose but a coalition of cities, not individual merchants. The first fully documented meeting of cities who considered themselves to be a Hansa happened in 1356. And this is a date that modern historians often mark as a symbolic beginning of Hansa. But as I said before, and this is something you should remember, it was not a funding event, because there was not a funding act. No one made a conscious decision to create a Hansa. It just happened to become a thing through gradual, very long process. Another very interesting thing, and something worth remembering, that membership was really informal. There was no formal charter that you had to sign. There was no oath to take. There was no ceremony to join or anything like this. Basically, cities joined Hansa by establishing trade connections with other Hansa members, by participating in this Hanseatic, that is like a sort of a parliament I will talk about later, appearing on this parliament, being accepted by other members who were already there, and obeying to the decisions of this parliament. And because of this very loose membership, it's actually really hard to tell how many cities belong to Hansa. But usually historians believe that there were around 70, maybe 77 cities that regularly participated in decision-making processes, and there were maybe around 200 cities that were more loosely connected. They belonged to the network, but not necessarily participating in all the decision-making process. They obeyed certain rules, or mostly obeyed them, but were not really super active in the Hansa. What glued together Hansa was the fact that most of the cities belonging to it were low German-speaking cities, and they all have some sort of a stake into Baltic Sea or Northern Sea trade. And they also typically operated under German town law, which also provided some legal cohesion, although not exactly political unity. And I will explain this later. So the next question is, why would anyone want to actually join Hansa? And there were actually really good reasons. There were very concrete benefits to belonging to it. First and foremost, members received special trading privileges in foreign markets. They received exemptions from certain taxes, duties, tolls, and so on. They received rights to use certain facilities like warehouses, tribunals, inns, dwellings, chapels, and other infrastructure of this kind. They received legal protections when trading abroad, and so on. The Hansa also made trade much more efficient because it shared information about prices, market conditions, sailing routes, debts, trustworthy and untrustworthy individuals, exchange rates, and so on. Hansa also standardized weights, measures quality at the level of individual towns, and something called contours. I will talk about them later. And this a lot of uncertainty when trading in foreign markets. it was not only the individual merchants that received a lot of benefits, but also cities themselves benefiting from being a part of Hansa. Mostly, they benefited from mutual protection. If a city was threatened by a pirate group, privateer group, or a predatory ruler, they could actually call other members of the network for help. And this meant that even relatively small cities actually could punch way above their weight class. So being a member of Hansa raised your political profile, your defensive opportunities, and so on. But most importantly, the Hansa, the network, acted like a cartel. Its main goal was to establish a monopoly in certain trades and exclude everyone else from trading in certain staple goods. And in medieval times, this kind of belonging to this kind of cartel was extremely profitable. And one of the very interesting thing about the Hansa is that due to this lot of economic opportunities, efficiency in trading and also cartelization, Hanseatic cities very quickly developed rather large middle class. Obviously, some of the traders were much more successful than the others, so the Hanseatic city was quite stratified. They had elites that you could call almost like a nobility, but they were very different from, for example, Italian cities. They were much less oligarchical. If I may use this word. So the benefits were spread rather widely. Okay, I said that there was some sort of legal cohesion due to shared culture, but it doesn't mean that Hansa itself was a politically unified network. It was a network of cities operating under very different conditions. Some of the cities belonging to Hansa were something that we called free imperial cities, basically the subject only of the emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Others were under rule of local overlords, feudal lords, princes, and in some cases also bishops or archbishops. And there were also some cities that were under the rule of military orders, mostly Teutonic knights. So there's, and the cities each had their own jurisdiction, they had their legal system, so there's nothing like unified Hanseatic law, nothing like this existed. That being said, most of the cities belonging to Hansa were established under something that we call Germanic town law. They were following either rules that were created for Lübeck or from Magdeburg. And this provided a bit of unity, but even more importantly, every Hanseatic city was basically ruled by the merchants themselves. And merchants ruling the cities naturally prioritized various commercial interests, and this aligned them reasonably well with the overall goal of the Hansa. The Hansa itself operated as a very decentralized federation. It had no fixed capital, or actually for a very long time, it didn't even have bureaucracy. Its main decision-making body was this Hanseatic that I mentioned as this body that met for the, not necessarily the first time, but first well-documented time in 1356 in Lübeck. This was a kind of a parliament, but it was a parliament that met irregularly, sometimes yearly, sometimes with gaps of several years. It was most often organized by Lübeck, but basically every Hanseatic city could organize it. The fact that Lübeck was the city that often organized it most often was mostly a result of the fact that Lübeck was one of the original, let's say, members, and it was also very well geographically positioned. It was just as well reachable from the eastern and western edges of Hansa. At Hansa, each town had one vote, and the decisions were made consensually. And this seems to be like a rather problematic system that is like really easy to break and not efficient in a sense that it's hard to come up with to a decision that would satisfy cities with various interests and so on. But we have actually pretty good evidence that it usually worked rather well. But it required a lot of effort. The fact that this diet met very irregularly was partially the outcome that before every session, a coalition needs to be formed in order to come up with some sort of agreement. And another thing to mention is that while in theory every city was equal, because every city had one vote, in practice, there were some cities that were definitely first among the equals. Lübeck, Danzig, Cologne, that were the biggest, richest, more powerful cities, had definitely much more influence, which in practice meant that if you wanted to pass some decision in this parliament, you need to make sure that the largest cities are on board. If any of them would say, no, I'm not interested, that basically this whole project would fail. As I said, there was no fixed capital, and there was no fixed bureaucracy for the very long time. Only in the late 16th century, in 1556, Hansa established something called a syndic, which was basically one person who was supposed to be legal counsel for Hansa and like a diplomat, official representative who would represent Hansa in international setting, would negotiate deals with various rulers and so on. When Hansa decided to establish this office, it also wanted to make the network more rigid, much better defined with very clear membership requirements and so on. But this actually failed. The Hansa never achieved to really formalize its existence. There's one like quasi-bureaucratic maybe thing that happened during its existence that were more successful than the office of syndic itself. It was the division into firsts and thirds and later quarters. It was basically a coalition of closely related cities that were neighbors that would meet more often than the Diet, and it would decide on like common positions to be presented at the Hanseatic meeting, or would try to resolve some disputes. Because, and this is another point, Hansa was never also very harmonious organization. It's not really surprising. I think that you know that cartels usually face internal problems, and this was also true with regard to Hansa. The major issue was that the cities have diverging interests. I told you that all the cities had a stake in either Baltic Sea trade or the Northern Sea trade. But sometimes this stakes meant that a city would take a different position than all the others. There's one pretty good example from 1420s when Lübeck and its allies were fighting Denmark. Some of the Saxon towns promised to help militarily by providing forces. But since they really didn't have a stake in Baltic trade, they procrastinated long enough that when the forces actually reached the conflict region, the conflict was basically over. It was like pure gesture. They didn't want to make any real effort. So basically, they were like free riding on what the Lübeck and its allies did. Even bigger problem was the fact that some of the cities were trying to break away from cartel. They were trying to make separate, or let's say, side deals with some of the other powers to secure monopoly rights for themselves and themselves only. And there were several such instances, and some of them resulted in major crises, including expulsion of cities from the Hanseatic League. So how Hansa dealt with disputes, with internal conflicts? Since it didn't have a bureaucracy, it had to rely on mediation and arbitration. This is completely ad hoc. Usually when two cities were quarreling, the uninvolved parties would step up, try to negotiate some sort of deal, or basically bully the parties that were quarreling to stop the infighting for the benefit of the Hansa network. And again, this was often enough because of all the benefits that come from being a member of the Hansa. The risk of being cut off from all this like monopoly profits was enough for the quarreling cities to say, okay, let's back down. Maybe this is not such a big issue in the grand scheme of things. But not always this kind of mediation or arbitration worked. Sometimes actually even failed, and then Hansa had to use its like ultimate trump card, that is expulsion. And there are several instances where some cities were expelled from Hansa. The most notable example that was most widely noted in the literature is Cologne example that was expelled from the Hansa in 1471. It was expelled from Hansa because the city made a side deal with England, one of the major competitors with Hansa. Hansa tried to make the Cologne change its mind, but it didn't budge. So it was expelled for 4 years, and during those 4 years, Cologne lost all its privileges. The merchants representing this city were banned from many markets controlled by Hansa, were banned from counters, like trading outposts. I'll explain this term later. They were forbidden to participate in the parliamentary meetings and so on. And after 4 years, Cologne eventually decided that siding up with England is actually not that profitable. There were like other things that happening in the meantime on a like larger European scale, but they eventually decided to obey by the decision of Hansa. They had to atone for this breaking the rules. They had to officially promise, make an oath that will never break the rule again, and they have to pay a very high restitution. But this kind of expulsion was extremely rare. And this is what I want to stress, because some of you who have like economic background, economic history background, may be familiar with the works of Avner Griff, Stanford historian, economic historian, who wrote a number of very influential work in this area. The very well respected historian, economic historian, and his works are really, really good and definitely worth your interest. But he claims that this expulsion was the major tool that Hansa used to ensure that there is like internal cohesion, there's the like internal unity. But modern research actually shows that this is not the case. That yes, Hansa had this card under its sleeve, but used it very, very rarely. There are maybe 4 or 5 more examples of expulsion, and all of them were like relatively short, no longer than like several months or a year. So Hansa relied more on like carrots than sticks. Okay, so I mentioned several times contours, and this is actually a very interesting aspect of Hansa. And this is probably something that is closest to a permanent hub. I think the best analogy for a contour is a cross between special economic zone and an embassy. Contours were basically trading outposts in foreign lands that specialized in certain goods, in trades in certain commodity staples and so on. And there were Hansa had 4 major contours. One in London, one in Novgorod, one in Bruges that later was moved to Antwerp, and one in Bergen in Norway. These were districts, in essence, sometimes walled, sometimes even fortified, that provided infrastructure necessary to securely deal with foreign merchants that did not belong to Hansa. So there would be warehouses, there would be inns, there would be various like offices, there would be chapels, there would be dwellings, and so on. And Hansa merchants were actually required to use contours. They were required to use contours for their protections, but also in order for the Hansa to make sure that they actually obey by the Hansa rules. For example, that they are using the prices set by Hansa, or that they are using quality standards set by Hansa. In practice, this meant that in some contours, merchants were actually not required to leave the district. They had to conduct all their business in, in this particular district, in this particular contract. They had to register all the transaction in this particular contract. So this was basically also like a surveillance mechanism to ensure that cartel is actually working. The cantors also served as like informational hubs. They were gathering intelligence on like foreign markets, foreign rulers, and so on. The cantors were like autonomous in a sense that they were not under the jurisdiction of a local ruler. Hansa basically negotiated that this area has its own autonomy, but cantors were not didn't have autonomy from Hansa itself. Representatives of various cities could come just to check if everything is in order, if no rules are being broken. Syndics, when they were established, also visited cantors for this purpose, and so on. Cantors had their own councils, they had their own statues, and they had their own like officials who were responsible for resolving disputes, organizing convoys, managing communal property, like for example chapels, inns, and so on, negotiating trade deals with local governments, etc. Cantors also had their own treasury because they were financed from fees. As I said, merchants belonging to Hansa were required to conduct all their business in cantors, and they had to pay a fee to use various infrastructure there. And this leads us to another point, how Hansa financed public goods. So it basically, in most cases, relied on voluntary contributions or cost-sharing agreements. In general, like each city was obviously responsible for its own expenses, like maintaining a harbor and stuff like this. This was on the city itself, and it was financed from its own budget. But whenever project arise that could provide benefit to more than one city, they would figure out a way to share this cost through some voluntary means. It usually relied on fees. So Hansa used, for example, convoy fees to protect the convoys against pirates or privateers. It used navigational fees to hire pilots who knew the routes really, really well. They also, Hansa also used cost-sharing mechanisms, for example, for lighthouse upkeep. And this is another thing that may be interesting to those of you who have like economic backgrounds. Exactly. So most of you know that at least in some well-known lighthouses, like believed to be like a textbook example of public good. Then Coast published a very, very influential article, Lighthouse in Economics, showcase that no, this is not the case. At least in England, lighthouses were privately funded, and actually the same is true about Hansa. So this lighthouse that you see on the slide, it's one of the longest still running lighthouses in the world. It's located in Estonia, and it was financed by Hansa. And this is just one example. Unfortunately, with lighthouses, we don't have a lot of primary sources that shows how exactly it was financed. Well, it was like first financed by the city, by some city, and then Hansa would pay for it from fees, or vice versa. We don't really know this. We know that they were publicly funded, but how it works in practice is just like another matter. Sometimes there were also like one-time expenses that were like really big. For example, sometimes Hansa had to actually go to war in order to protect its interest. And what then? The usual case was that parliament would be organized, and once the city agreed that yes, this particular situation really requires us to mobilize military forces, they would assign like quotas to various cities proportionally to their size, to their wealth, to their fleet, and in this way would mobilize a navy that could defend the interest of Hansa. But there's also another method used very, very rarely, but quite definitely worth mentioning because it's quite unusual. In 1461, Hansa decided to establish a tax. One-time tax that was in effect for several months, but it was a compulsory tax. It was an export duty that everyone who used ports belonging to Hanseatic cities had to pay. So not only the Hanseatic merchants had to pay it, but everyone who was using Hanseatic ports. And this was tax that was used to finance one of the very many wars that Hansa had against Denmark. And this is actually like worth mentioning because it's super unusual. Back then, only sovereigns could basically tax anyone. Hansa made a break from this like general rule. Late in its existence, when the syndic office was created, the syndics tried to establish like a regular payment that would go to a treasury administrated by syndic. So that he could finance the diplomatic expeditions and stuff like this, but this was not a successful attempt. Most of the cities did not participate in this scheme. Okay, I'm already a bit over my time. Hope you don't mind. So I'll go rather quickly through the next slides. So Hansa being like super profitable, obviously it had a lot of competitors who wanted to gain at least a share of the market that Hansa was cornering. And the main competitors were the Dutch, the English, especially something called like English merchant adventurers, Denmark, and the Great Duchy of Moscow. And Hansa employed various ways to protect its interest. It used economic sanctions, it used blockades, it entered into treaties and alliances with friendly powers against common enemies, and it's also very successful at lobbying or maybe bribing. One of the interesting features of Comtars is that some Comtars had like a special fund in their treasuries that was used for like as diplomatic means. It was back then like regular taxation was not really well established, which meant that rulers quite often would suffer from lack of funds to realize the projects that they were interested in. Hansa would then be very happy to give a loan, a gift, or in any other way use their finances to basically influence the ruler to do something in its favor. And it worked more often than not. As I said earlier, Hansa relied mostly on like diplomacy or bribes when dealing with problems, but it was not shying away from actually using military power. And there are several instances that where Hansa used force to achieve its goal. Its most famous military victory was against Denmark in 1468 to 1470. The League established something called the Confederation of Cologne, and it managed to organize a fleet of around 80 ships and basically crushed one of the major sea powers of Northern Europe. Interestingly enough, Hansa didn't have warships. They basically relied on merchant ships, in early history on cogs, later on something called hulks. And when the need arose, they would basically convert the ships they already were using for military purposes. And the ships they were using, they're not really that great at open sea warfare, but they were extremely good at blockades and at sieges. And this became like a preferable tactic that Hansa used. Hansa would also employ privateers very often with very good results. So they had many different ways to mobilize large forces, and at its peak of its power, it basically could rival any nation state in Europe. Later on, especially in 17th century, when the unity was broken through for various reasons, I will say about it later, this military power was much less significant, and it proved to be one of the issues that led to Hansa downfall. Okay, so yeah, why did it eventually fail? There are like several reasons. Some of them are like, let's say, objective in a sense that the Hansa could not do really anything about them. One of them is climate change. At later stages of its existence, Europe entered into a little ice age that changed a lot when it comes to local economies. Some of the fishing stocks that Hansa relied on migrated westwards, and Baltic cities lost quite a lot of economic power at the expense of the Dutch. We have major geographical discoveries that also shifted the trade routes. The trade with Americas became much more important and much more profitable than the trade in this Baltic Sea or even Northern Sea region. But there were also some issues that Hansa could have prevented or could adapt it to, but didn't. And the major one is changes, I would say, in how economies and how companies operate. Basically, throughout its whole existence, Hansa used a guild model for all its like commercial activities, which is quite good at establishing and enforcing monopoly, but really bad at innovating. It's very rigorous, very formalized, There's a lot of like ceremonies involved, so it's not really adaptable to changing circumstances. And in 15th and especially 16th century, in Dutch region and in England, some of the Hansa competitors started using this like newly created idea of joint stock companies that were much more efficient, much more adaptable, and basically managed to, let's say, steal quite a lot of market from Hansa, and Hansa couldn't do really much about it. But probably the most important factor that led to the downfall and decline of Hansa was the rise of very strong nation states in the region that Hansa operated. These nation states were not happy to have any sort of competitors, especially ones who have like autonomy, their own jurisdictions. So they used various methods to limit the autonomy or ultimately just basically crush it completely. There were many different ways that rulers did achieve this effect. Novgorod was basically captured by military force. The Hanseatic merchants were expelled and could not deal with the overwhelming military force of the Grand Duchy of Moscow. And again, it's like a symbolic, not necessarily concrete date that usually demarks at the end of the Hansa is this Westphalian peace that ended 30-year war in Europe. It was in 1648. Many of the cities that belonged to Hansa were affected by this war, and when the peace negotiations started in this like Westphalian region, Hansa sent an envoy to participate in this peace negotiation, but basically none of the other parties that participated in negotiations were even interested in hearing it. And they were not interested in hearing it because Hansa was not a nation state. It was seen as a like completely obsolete construct that doesn't fit into the modern political landscape. And basically from this moment on, Hansa lost any of the power in order to enter into deal with other international other entities that were forming international order. Okay, last two slides. I will not go to each row or a column here. I hope that you can see that there are some like convergences between Hansa and the network sense in Balaji's sense. Start small, grow by opt-in mechanism. Membership is on this like exit voice axis. Oh yeah, one more thing that's probably worth mentioning. I forgot to tell you about before. You were joining Hansa by opt-in, but you could also opt out. And there are many examples, especially of Dutch cities, that in the 16th century decided that being in Hansa is no longer profitable for them. They're shifting their trade routes to a completely different region, and they decided that they will no longer participate in the network, and that was it. Basically, no one tried to stop them from leaving or anything like this. Again, geographically, we have a multi-node polycentric entity, governance super lightweight bureaucracy, if at all. There's definitely this idea of that rules are more important than rulers. Public good provision, mostly through voluntary means, through some exceptions, as I mentioned. And diplomacy, this is absolutely crucial. Both need for external legitimacy. And this is, I believe that this is one of the, not the only one, but one of the crucial problems of Balaji's idea. Like, in the end, what Balaji wants to establish is a state. It's an entity that has international legitimacy. It's actually recognized by other players in the international orders as an equal participant. I think that Hansa example shows that this is extremely hard to achieve. Once the nation states started to recognize like, only each other, breaking from the system is going to be super, super hard. I'm not sure if it's like impossible, but I'm much less optimistic than Balaji is about this particular. Okay. Obviously, there are divergences. There's no point in dwelling about like all the technological or civilizational differences. These are obvious, but there are some also other like unit of memberships. Hansa was not a network of individuals. It was a network of cities, which also like limits the flexibility. Balaji has this like idea that network state form around one commandment, you know, keto kosher idea or something like this. Hansa was different. It actually had a shared culture. Most of the countries were low German-speaking countries. They all were very commercially directed, very commercially driven, and so on. Contors also served as this mechanism that was creating some like cultural unity, because merchants from different areas of Hansa would meet at Contor, would spend months and months together, and basically create like an internal culture as a result. But there was Hansa did not have an idea to create actually culture. The culture just resulted as a natural, result of interactions between people who already have some sort of shared values. It was not trying to be a moral innovator. Adaptability, as I said, here Hansa failed because it adhered to this very rigid guild model that proved to be way too inflexible to compete with like joint stock companies and everything else that followed them. And another divergence is this like a recognition environment. So when Hansa started, the nation state was not really well-established concept. If you look at the map of Europe in like 12th, 13th century, it's a conglomerate of a lot of different polities that were competing each other. The borders are constantly shifting. The order has a lot of polycentric features and so on. But in 17th century, this basically all came to end. After the Westphalic peace or series of treaties, because that's not one but several, basically a new rule of international order was established, but that only nation state are legitimate actors. I don't want to like over-stress this point, because there's a lot of like modern historians claims that there's this myth of Westphalian order that was like created in 17th century, when in fact it was a myth retroactively created in like 19th century, when we see another wave of like nation building. But it's definitely the case that in 17th century, basically nation states started to recognize each other as the only legitimate players. And this is basically the system we are living right now, and this is something that Balaji's nation states have, network states have to deal with. Have to find some way of breaking out of this order, and it's definitely not going to be easy. Okay. If you want to know more, there are several books and obviously lots and lots of papers about it. I choose this one because they're quite accessible, not necessarily in the sense that they are cheap, but in this group, I'm pretty sure that you can find ways of reading these books without losing a shirt. If you would like to read just one, I would definitely recommend this one, The Sovereign State and Its Competitors, because this one it basically explains the whole order that we are dealing with right now, international order, how it came about, and what preceded it. Hansa is one really interesting example, but not the only one. There are many competitors to a nation state. Okay, thank you.